Chapter 1. A War We Cannot Win. 1 week after the Battle of Vyrex. The Void engine had been destroyed, but the Vyrex were still alive, and they were already spreading. Across the galaxy, reports poured in from scattered human outposts. Planets had gone dark overnight, colony ships traveling through the outer rim vanished without a trace. And when recon teams were sent to investigate, they found nothing left. No bodies, no debris, just empty, lifeless ruins. Something was happening, and humanity wasn't ready for it. A silent system. Until it screamed the tyrant's bane, humanity's flagship moved through the silence of the Targus system, its gunmetal hull reflecting the dim glow of a dying star. On the bridge, Admiral Evelyn Kasari, 46, stood with her arms crossed, her steel-gray eyes locked onto the holographic map of a missing colony world. The war against the Dominion had left her scarred, both inside and out. The streaks of silver in her dark brown hair were more pronounced now, but her posture was as unyielding as ever. Commander Daniel Roark, 38, leaned against the war table, his rugged, battle-scarred face twisted into a deep frown. His dirty blonde hair was tousled from lack of sleep, his chiseled jawline lined with 5 days' worth of stubble. "So let me get this straight," Roark muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "A colony of 3 million people just disappeared?" Kasari's voice was cold, emotionless. No distress signals, no escape pods, not even debris. Roark exhaled sharply. "That's not an invasion, that's extermination." Kasari's steel-gray eyes flickered with something unreadable. "No," she turned to the viewport, watching as their fleet drifted through the empty void. "It's something worse." First contact. Again, minutes later, the fleet reached the missing colony, and it was worse than they had imagined. The planet, once teeming with life, was now an unrecognizable husk. The surface was not destroyed, not bombed, not burned. It was changed. The cities, the buildings, the forests. Everything had been reshaped, twisted into grotesque biomechanical structures, black spires coiling like the ribs of some monstrous creature. And at the center of the transformation, a massive pulsing structure of shifting black exoskeleton and blue bioluminescent veins. The Vyrex had left their mark. Roark stared through the viewport, his ice-blue eyes narrowing. "They aren't just killing people." His voice was tight, controlled. "They're harvesting them." Kasari's jaw tightened, and then the planet spoke. A deep pulse of energy rippled through the void, vibrating through the hull of the fleet. A voice whispered through their minds. A chorus of cold, inhuman thought. "You have come again, curious. You fight for survival. We fight for perfection." Kasari's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't like talking to the Dominion. This wasn't like anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement of fact. The Vyrex didn't care about humanity's war. They were simply continuing what they had started eons ago. The message faded. Then the planet moved. The entire biomechanical landscape began to shift, like a living organism awakening from sleep. Massive Vyrex creatures, taller than any Dominion war machine, unfolded from the blackened spires, their glowing veins pulsing brighter. Kasari snapped back to reality. "All ships, battle positions, now. The Battle of Targus begins." The Vyrex did not fight like the Dominion. They did not have warships. They did not have battle formations. They became the battlefield itself. As the human fleet opened fire, the biomechanical structures of the planet twisted, sending massive tendrils lashing through space, tearing into warships like they were paper. "Jesus Christ," Roark growled, gripping the command rail as the tyrant's bane shook violently, explosions tearing across the fleet. "It's like the planet itself is attacking us." Kasari's mind raced. Every battle she had ever fought had been against an enemy with rules. The Dominion had war fleets. The Dominion had strategy. The Vyrex had neither. They were something else entirely. She turned to the weapons officer. "Launch the antimatter warheads. Full spread." "Ma'am, that will glass the entire biosphere." Kasari's steel-gray eyes were ice-cold. "That's the point. The kill order." The tyrant's bane's missile bays opened, launching a full spread of antimatter warheads toward the planet. The Vyrex felt it coming. The whispers returned, brushing against Kasari's mind like a shadow. "You destroy what you do not understand. You burn what you cannot control. How primitive. Kasari clenched her fists behind her back. You have no idea what we're capable of. The warheads detonated. A blinding shockwave erupted, ripping through the Vyrex biomass, setting off a chain reaction that turned the entire infected planet into a firestorm. Kasari and Roark watched in silence as the planet burned. The battle was over. For now, the aftermath, and the next step. As the firestorm faded, Kasari turned to Roark. His blue eyes were still locked onto the smoldering remains. He exhaled. One colony down. How many more? Kasari didn't answer immediately, because she already knew the truth. This was just one world, just one Vyrex nest. There were hundreds more. The Vyrex were already spreading, and if they didn't stop them now, there wouldn't be anything left to save. She took a slow breath, eyes narrowing. We don't stop, we hunt them down, every last one. And so, the war began again. Chapter 2. The Vyrex Counterattack. 12 hours after the destruction of Targus, the Vyrex homeworld burned in the void, its grotesque biomechanical spires reduced to ashen skeletons floating in orbit. The once pulsing blue veins of its living structures had turned dark, dead. A victory. A decisive, overwhelming blow. And yet, Admiral Evelyn Kasari, 46, felt no relief. She stood on the bridge of the Tyrant's Bane, her steel-gray eyes locked onto the holographic display of the smoldering planet below. Around her, the command crew whispered amongst themselves. They had won. They had killed an entire Vyrex nest before it could spread. Then why did it feel too easy? No Vyrex vessels tried to escape, Kasari muttered under her breath. Commander Daniel Roark, 38, leaned against the war table, arms crossed, his rugged, battle-worn face twisted in thought. His dirty blonde hair was tousled from days of fighting, his ice-blue eyes sharp with suspicion. Maybe they didn't think we'd actually do it, he said, his voice edged with forced confidence. Kasari's jaw tightened. They weren't trying to win, they were stalling. The realization hit both of them at the same time. The Vyrex never fought to defend the planet. They fought to buy time. Kasari turned to her tactical officer, her voice cold. Get me fleet-wide comms, now. But before the order could be executed, the ship screamed. A high-pitched biomechanical howl tore through the hull, ripping through the comm systems like an organic virus. Screens flickered and cracked, lights dimmed, and a deep pulse of energy vibrated through the floor of the warship. And then, the fleet's long-range scanners went dark. Kasari's heart slammed in her chest. Something was coming. Something big. The Vyrex adaptation. The fleet's external cameras snapped back online, but what they saw was impossible. The remains of the Vyrex homeworld were moving. Not debris, not wreckage. Something was growing. From the molten core of the dead planet, massive tendrils of blackened exoskeletal material erupted, weaving together in impossible formations, stretching across the burning wasteland. Jesus Christ, Roark whispered, his blue eyes wide with disbelief. Kasari's pulse thundered in her ears. They hadn't destroyed the Vyrex homeworld. They had triggered its next phase of evolution. The birth of the Vyrex dreadnoughts. The Vyrex didn't have warships in the traditional sense. They had never needed them. They were the battlefield. And now, they were becoming something worse. Across the dead planet's surface, massive colony structures began folding inward, coiling into massive, living, starship-sized entities. They were building themselves into biomechanical warships. These weren't constructed. They weren't piloted. They were born. And the first one rose into the void, its massive, chitinous wings stretching out like a nightmare unfolding. Kasari gritted her teeth. All hands, battle stations. We are not running. The battle of the dying world. The Tyrant's Bane fired first, its main railgun unleashing a round the size of a skyscraper toward the Vyrex dreadnought, sending a shockwave rippling through the void. The impact tore through the creature's outer carapace, but instead of damage, the wound closed instantly, the exoskeletal plating regenerating like flesh, knitting itself back together. The Vyrex ship didn't just survive the impact, it adapted to it. Kasari's fingers curled into a fist. Adjust firing parameters. Full spectrum plasma. We overload its ability to regenerate. The fleet adjusted, shifting tactics. The next barrage rained hell on the Vyrex dreadnought, plasma beams melting through its hull, preventing it from sealing its wounds. And then, for the first time, the Vyrex retaliated. The dreadnought did not fire traditional weapons. Instead, its biomechanical body began to change, its organic plating shifting into living cannons, its veins pulsing with electric blue energy. And then, it screamed. A wave of energy erupted outward, not a beam, not a missile, a frequency. The moment it hit, half the fleet's ships powered down instantly, their systems shorting out as if they had been infected with a virus. The crew collapsed, gripping their heads, screaming as if something was tearing into their minds. Kasari's vision blurred. For a fraction of a second, she saw something. A memory that wasn't hers. A galaxy burning, not from war, from erasure. And the Vyrex standing in the ashes, unchanged, watching. She ripped herself free from the hallucination, gasping for breath. Fire! Everything! Now! The fleet unleashed everything it had, and finally, the Vyrex dreadnought cracked apart, its massive, monstrous body disintegrating into void matter. Kasari exhaled sharply, her body trembling. That wasn't a warship. That was a life form older than humanity itself. And the Vyrex had just begun to evolve. The aftermath, and a terrifying realization. Roark sat against the wreckage of the command rail, wiping blood from his lip. His ice-blue eyes locked onto the dying embers of the Vyrex ship, his mind still reeling from what he had seen. He turned to Kasari, his voice low, tense. What the hell was that? Kasari's steel-gray eyes were unreadable. She turned to the comm officer. Send out a warning. All human colonies are to go dark, now. No transmissions, no travel, no signals. Roark's jaw clenched. You think they're listening? Kasari didn't look at him. She stared into the cold abyss of space, her scarred face set in stone-cold certainty. They don't need to listen. They already know. She turned back to the war map, staring at the next Vyrex nest. The Vyrex had started their evolution, which meant humanity had to evolve too. The next war had already begun, and this time, the rules had changed. Chapter 3. The Vyrex infection begins, 4 days after the Battle of the Dying World. The galaxy was no longer silent. Every day, new transmissions vanished mid-sentence. Human colonies, once filled with millions, went dark overnight. There were no survivors, no distress signals, just empty, lifeless worlds. The Vyrex weren't conquering. They weren't invading. They were replacing. A message from the dead. Aboard the Tyrant's Bane, Admiral Evelyn Kasari, 46, stood alone in her private war chamber, staring at the last transmission from Outpost Delphi 6. On the flickering screen, a Marine stood in the wreckage of a once thriving colony, his combat armor ripped apart, his breathing ragged. His dark-skinned face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide with horror. Admiral, if anyone's listening, don't send reinforcements. Just burn it. Burn the whole damn planet. A high-pitched sound cut through the background. Not a scream, not a voice, but a whisper, like 1,000 thoughts speaking at once. The Marine whirled around, rifle raised. The screen shook as the camera tilted, revealing something standing behind him. It looked human. Or at least, it had been. Its skin was blackened exoskeleton, pulsing with blue veins. Its face still had the remnants of a human jawline, but the mouth was wrong. Split too wide, mandibles twitching as it breathed. And worst of all, its eyes were still human. They were aware. And they were smiling. The Marine screamed, opened fire. The transmission cut to static. Kasari stood motionless. For the first time in the war, she felt something she hadn't felt since she was a child on a dying Earth. Fear. She turned to the holotable, her scarred hands gripping the edges as the truth settled in her bones. The Vyrex weren't just spreading. They were turning humans into them. The mission. Track the infection commander Daniel Roark, 38, entered the war room, his rugged, battle-scarred face tight with exhaustion. His dirty blonde hair was still damp from the last battlefield debrief, his blue eyes hard and calculating. He had seen the transmission, and he wasn't smiling. So what's the plan? Roark asked, voice low. Kasari's steel-gray eyes flickered. We find out how the infection spreads. Roark exhaled, rubbing his scruffy jawline. That means sending in a ground team. Kasari's jaw clenched. That means you. Roark gave a sharp laugh, shaking his head. Knew you were gonna say that. Kasari's face remained stone cold. If we don't stop this now, there won't be a humanity left to fight for. Roark's smirk faded. When do we leave? The descent to Delphi 6 hours later, Roark and his strike team landed on the surface of Delphi 6, the lost colony world. The moment the dropship doors opened, the stench of rot filled the air. The city was eerily intact. Buildings stood untouched, vehicles still parked in the streets. But there was no movement, no sound. It was like the world had been paused. Roark gripped his plasma rifle, his ice blue eyes scanning the shadows between buildings. He tapped his comms. "Kasari, we're on the ground. No signs of life. Yet." Her voice came through, calm but razor sharp. "Keep moving. If you see anything unnatural, you call it in. No heroics." Roark smirked. "You know me." There was a pause. Then Kasari's voice, dry as ice. "That's exactly why I said it." Roark chuckled. And then the whispering started. The Vyrex have already won. The whispering wasn't sound. It was thought. Roark gritted his teeth, trying to block it out, but it wasn't coming from an external source. It was inside his own head. The team froze, weapons raised, scanning the city. And then they saw them. Humans. At least, they had been. They stood motionless in the streets, their bodies covered in shifting black exoskeleton, their faces frozen in eerie, lifeless expressions. And then, one of them turned. Its eyes locked onto Roark, and it spoke, not with a mouth, but inside his mind. "You came too late." Roark opened fire. The infection spreads. The city exploded into chaos. The turned humans surged forward, their movements impossibly fast, their bones snapping and reforming as they adapted mid-charge. Roark's squad fired in every direction, but the Vyrex didn't fall like normal soldiers. Wounds sealed instantly. Severed limbs grew back within seconds. Roark's pulse pounded. They weren't fighting humans anymore. They were fighting a virus in human skin. And they were already surrounded. Kasari's decision: eradicate the colony. On the Tyrant's Bane, Kasari watched the battle unfold through Roark's helmet feed. Her fingers curled into fists. She could hear the whispers through the transmission. The Vyrex weren't just fighting. They were offering them a choice. You don't have to die. You can evolve. Kasari's gray eyes burned. She turned to the weapons officer. Charge the orbital cannon. Prepare for planetary sterilization. The crew froze. "Ma'am, our men are still down there." Roark is still. Kasari's voice was like a gunshot. "This is not a rescue mission. If we let the infection spread, there will be no stopping it." A heavy silence fell over the bridge. Then, Roark's voice cut through the comms, loud and clear. "Kasari, do it." Kasari's throat tightened. She had sent thousands to their deaths before. But this was Roark, her second in command, her oldest friend. She took a shaky breath, then steeled herself. Fire. The death of Delphi 6. The Tyrant's Bane unleashed a single, devastating energy blast. The entire planet erupted into white-hot fire, consuming everything. Kasari stood motionless, watching as the flames swallowed every structure, every street, every infected human. Roark was gone. The whispers stopped. The planet was erased. And yet, in the cold silence of the bridge, Kasari knew this wasn't over. The Vyrex had already spread, and the war had only just begun. Chapter 4. The Last Stand of Humanity. 12 hours after the destruction of Delphi 6, the Vyrex had made their final move. Humanity had one last chance, and Admiral Evelyn Kasari, 46, was not about to surrender. The battle for Earth had already begun. The betrayal of Commander Roark. Aboard the Tyrant's Bane, Kasari stood in the center of the bridge, her steel-gray eyes locked onto the holoscreen where Commander Daniel Roark, 38, stared back at her. But it wasn't him anymore. His dirty blonde hair was the same, his scarred jawline, his broad-shouldered, battle-worn form, still the same. But his ice-blue eyes now glowed with eerie bioluminescence, pulsing like the Vyrex. And when he spoke, his voice was softer but colder than before. "Kasari, stand down. The war is over. You just have to stop fighting." Kasari's blood ran cold. Her best friend, her second in command, the only man she trusted in this war. He was one of them now. And she was seconds away from pulling the trigger. The last human fleet. The Vyrex were everywhere. Hundreds of Vyrex dreadnoughts, their shifting biomechanical hulls pulsing, moved toward Earth like an unstoppable tide. The last human fleet, what remained of Earth's defenders, was outnumbered 20-1. Kasari had one shot. She turned to the bridge crew. "Prepare the superweapon. Full charge." "Ma'am, that will incinerate Earth's entire orbit." Kasari's gray eyes burned like steel. "Do it. If they didn't stop the Vyrex now, they never would." Roark's final offer on the Iron Fang. Roark tilted his head slightly, his glowing blue eyes flickering. "I know you, Kasari," he murmured. "I know what you're thinking. I know you're about to destroy everything. But what if we don't have to lose? What if humanity can evolve? What if I told you we could win, together?" Kasari's jaw clenched. "You're not, Roark." Roark smirked. "Oh, but I am. I'm just... more." Kasari's hand hovered over the fire control. She had never hesitated before, but this was Roark, her oldest friend, her most trusted soldier. "We can be more, Kasari," Roark said softly. "We can be the future." Kasari's finger hovered over the button, and then her steel gray eyes hardened. "I already chose our future, and it doesn't include you." She slammed her fist onto the console. The superweapon fires, the Vyrex burn aboard the Tyrant's Bane. The entire warship vibrated as the superweapon came online. A massive ring of plasma energy built along the ship's spine, its light blinding, a burning white sun forming in the depths of space. The Vyrex felt it coming. The dreadnoughts shifted, their hulls morphing, warping. But it was too late. Kasari's lips curled into a merciless whisper. Bang! And then the firestorm came. A wave of pure destruction erupted from the Tyrant's Bane, sweeping across the battlefield like the wrath of a dying god. The first Vyrex dreadnoughts disintegrated instantly. The second wave shrieked as their bodies liquefied, their chitinous armor melting, their pulsing veins bursting into nothingness. The entire Vyrex fleet was caught in the blast. There was no regeneration this time, no evolution, no survival. The Vyrex fleet burned, and for the first time in history, they lost. The duel between Roark and Kasari, the Iron Fang was still intact. Roark was still alive. Kasari wasn't done. Lock onto Roark's ship. Prepare for boarding. Her second in command. Her best friend. She was going to end this personally. Inside the Iron Fang, Kasari stormed through the burning corridors of the Iron Fang, her pulse rifle raised, stepping over the bodies of Vyrex-infested crew members. She found him standing at the heart of the ship, waiting for her. Roark looked the same, yet entirely different. His muscular frame was clad in reinforced Dominion battle armor, but his skin had changed, veins pulsing with blue light, his hands flexing with unnatural precision. Kasari raised her rifle. "You're not Roark anymore." Roark smirked, that same cocky grin she'd seen 1,000 times before. "Maybe, but you're still predictable, Kasari, and that's why you'll lose." Then he lunged. The final fight. It was brutal, close, deadly. Roark was inhumanly fast, dodging bullets before they left the barrel. Kasari fought like a soldier, her strikes precise, her movements unrelenting. But Roark was stronger now, faster. He slammed her against the bulkhead, his grip crushing. "You can't stop this, Kasari." His voice was almost gentle. She spat blood. "I already did." And then she activated the ship's self-destruct. Roark's eyes widened. Kasari smiled coldly. "I win." She ripped a plasma blade from her belt and drove it into Roark's chest. His body convulsed, blue veins flaring, and then he collapsed. Dead. For real this time. Kasari exhaled, chest heaving, heart pounding. She had done it. She had killed the last trace of the Vyrex. The aftermath. Humanity's future. Minutes later, Kasari stood on the bridge of the Tyrant's Bane, watching as the Iron Fang detonated in a massive fireball, taking the last remnants of the Vyrex with it. The war was over, humanity had won, but Kasari felt nothing, no relief, no victory, just emptiness. She turned to the war map, where the galaxy stretched before her. They had survived. But at what cost? Kasari's steel gray eyes narrowed. There would be more threats, more wars, more battles, and she would be ready. Humanity wasn't going to kneel to any alien empire ever again, because this time, they were the apex predators of the galaxy, and nothing would ever threaten them again.